The CEO's uncharted territory. He was a titan of industry, a man who measured life in profits and perfectly executed plans. Then, a quiet cafe, a child's unexpected tears, and a flash of startlingly familiar blue eyes shattered his carefully constructed world. His past just walked in, and it had his name written all over it. Before we dive into this incredible tale, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Enjoy the story, and remember to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and subscribe to our channel for more surprising journeys. Alexander Thorne had built his entire life on control. In business, in negotiations, in life, everything followed a meticulously crafted plan. There were no surprises, no missed opportunities, no loose ends. That was his mantra, the foundation of Thorne Innovations, the secret to his unparalleled success. But tonight, for the first time in years, he had deliberately stepped away from the structured world of corporate boardrooms and investor galas. He craved anonymity, a quiet meal somewhere far from the usual Michelin-starred extravagance. He found himself in The Daily Grind, a small, family-owned cafe on the bustling outskirts of Manchester. It was warm and welcoming, the air thick with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and toasted pastries. This was the kind of place where locals gathered, where genuine laughter filled the booths instead of hushed business conversations. Baristas bustled behind the counter, greeting regulars by name, and a comforting hum of familiarity permeated the space. Alexander chose a secluded table by the window, ordering a simple artisan sandwich and a strong espresso. He allowed himself a rare moment to simply sit and breathe, to observe without the crushing weight of deadlines. It was strange how unfamiliar true relaxation felt. He was about to take his first sip of coffee when a sound cut through the gentle murmur of the cafe, a soft, trembling sob. He glanced up, scanning the room until his gaze landed on a small figure near the counter. A little girl sat on the floor, her tiny shoulders shaking as she wiped at her face with small fists. She couldn't have been older than 4. Dark, curly hair framed her round face, and even from a distance, Alexander could see the strikingly bright blue of her eyes, brimming with tears. Something in his chest tightened. Alexander wasn't the kind of man who got involved in personal matters, let alone the problems of strangers. But something about this little girl, sitting alone on the floor of a busy cafe, looking lost and scared, made it impossible to look away. He pushed back his chair and stood, crossing the room in a few strides. He crouched down beside her, making sure not to startle her. "Hello there," he said gently. "Are you okay?" The little girl sniffled, looking up at him with tear-streaked cheeks. "I'm lost," she whispered. Alexander felt a surprising pang of concern. He had expected to hear something like, "I dropped my toy," or "I spilled my drink." But lost? That was different. He glanced around, scanning the cafe for a panicked parent, but no one seemed to be searching for a missing child. That only made his concern grow. "What's your name?" he asked, keeping his voice calm. The girl hesitated, then used her tiny sweater sleeve to wipe her nose. "Daisy." Alexander nodded, offering her a reassuring smile. "That's a beautiful name, Daisy. Where's your mum?" Daisy's small lips wobbled. She shook her head. "Mommy was here, but then she went away. She said she'd be right back, but I couldn't find her anymore." Alexander exhaled slowly, realizing what must have happened. If her mother worked here, she had probably stepped away for just a moment, expecting Daisy to stay put. But Daisy, being a small, active child, had wandered off instead. He wasn't sure why he felt so compelled to help. He could have called a barista over, let them handle it, gone back to his table and his untouched sandwich. But something about Daisy's wide, frightened eyes kept him in place. "Does your mother work here?" he asked. Daisy nodded. "She's a barista." That confirmed it. Alexander looked around again, spotting a few baristas weaving between tables, their trays balanced on their arms, but none of them seemed to be looking for a child. "All right," he said. "Let's find her together, okay?" Daisy hesitated for only a second before slipping her small hand into his much larger one. The warmth of it surprised him. He wasn't used to holding something so small, so delicate. It felt unfamiliar. But as they walked together through the cafe, searching for Daisy's mother, Alexander had no idea that this moment, this small, seemingly insignificant decision, would change his life forever. Alexander walked slowly through the cafe, his large hand carefully holding Daisy's tiny one as he scanned the busy room. The warmth of her fingers felt strangely fragile against his palm, and he found himself gripping her just a little tighter, as if afraid she might slip away. Daisy stayed close to him, her free hand clutching the hem of her small sweater. Her big blue eyes darted around the cafe, looking for a familiar face, but the more they walked, the more uncertain she seemed. "Do you remember where she was when you last saw her?" Alexander asked, keeping his voice gentle. Daisy hesitated, then pointed toward the back of the cafe, where the coffee machines hummed loudly. "She was over there," she said. "But she went to make coffee for someone, and then I didn't see her anymore." Alexander nodded, leading her in that direction. The cafe was still bustling, but as they moved closer to the counter, something shifted. A voice cut through the noise, frantic, full of worry. "Daisy!" Daisy immediately perked up, turning toward the sound. A woman rushed toward them, weaving through tables with the urgency of someone who had been searching for far too long. She wore a simple black apron over a white shirt, and her long, dark hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail. Her dark eyes were wide with panic until they landed on Daisy, and relief washed over her features. Daisy's face lit up. "Mommy!" Before Alexander could react, the little girl let go of his hand and ran straight into her mother's arms. The woman scooped her up, holding her tightly against her chest. "Oh my God, baby, where did you go?" Her voice wavered as she smoothed Daisy's hair, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I told you to stay near the counter." "I did," Daisy mumbled into her shoulder. "But then I didn't see you and I got scared." The woman exhaled shakily, closing her eyes for a brief second, before pulling back to check her daughter's face. "Are you okay? You're not hurt?" Daisy shook her head. "I'm okay." Alexander, who had taken a step back to give them space, found himself frozen as the woman finally lifted her gaze to look at him. And in an instant, everything shifted. Alexander knew those eyes. The color was different, dark brown instead of Daisy's bright blue. But the shape, the way they widened in shock, the way they reflected something raw and unspoken, it was all too familiar. He knew her. She knew him. A moment of silence passed between them, stretching long and heavy. "Alexander?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, like she didn't quite believe what she was seeing. Alexander felt something tighten in his chest. He hadn't heard that voice in years, but he still recognized it. "Clara," he said, his own voice lower than usual. Her grip on Daisy tightened slightly, as if on instinct. Alexander couldn't move. He couldn't think. Because now that he was looking at her, really looking at her, a realization hit him so hard it nearly knocked the air from his lungs. Daisy. Dark hair. Blue eyes. She wasn't just any little girl. She wasn't just a lost child in a cafe. She looked exactly like him. Alexander's stomach dropped. He felt his hands curl into fists as he forced himself to breathe. He turned his gaze back to Clara, his jaw tightening. "Tell me the truth," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. His heart pounded as he asked the question that would change everything. Is she my daughter? Clara felt her breath catch in her throat. Her arms instinctively tightened around Daisy, as if she could somehow shield her daughter from the weight of the moment. She had imagined this scenario countless times, had thought about what she would say if she ever saw Alexander again. But she had never been prepared for the real thing. Alexander stood in front of her, his broad shoulders tense, his blue eyes locked onto her with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. He had always had that presence, the kind that demanded answers without having to say much. But now, there was something different in his gaze, something raw, something she couldn't escape. Is she my daughter? His voice was quieter this time, but the demand in his tone remained. Clara's heart pounded in her chest. She had always known this day would come. She just hadn't expected it to happen in the middle of a crowded cafe, with Daisy's small arms wrapped around her neck, oblivious to the storm that was about to break. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. Lying wasn't an option. She had already kept the truth from him for years, and she knew there was no way to deny it now, not when Daisy was standing right there, looking like a miniature version of him. Clara closed her eyes for a brief second, before meeting his gaze again. Yes, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She's yours. The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stared at her, his expression unreadable, as if he were trying to process the weight of what she had just said. Clara braced herself for anger, for accusations, for anything, but the look in his eyes wasn't just anger. It was something deeper, something almost like betrayal. How long? His voice was controlled, but she could hear the tension beneath it. Clara swallowed hard. 4 years. Alexander exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dark hair. 4 years, he repeated, as if saying it out loud would make it feel real. He looked back at Daisy, who was watching them both with quiet curiosity, completely unaware of the meaning behind their conversation. Why didn't you tell me? His voice was lower now, but there was no mistaking the sharp edge to it. Clara's fingers curled slightly against Daisy's back. Because you had your whole life ahead of you, she said, forcing herself to keep her voice steady. You were building an empire. You had investors, meetings, deals worth millions. You were traveling across the world, barely stopping for anything. She broke off, shaking her head. I didn't want to be the person who held you back. Alexander let out a quiet, humorless laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. Held me back. His blue eyes burned into hers. You didn't think I had the right to make that choice for myself? Clara's chest tightened. I thought I was doing the right thing. Alexander's jaw clenched. The right thing. His voice was lower now, coarser. You decided for me, Clara. You decided that I didn't deserve to know my own daughter, that I didn't deserve to be there for her. Clara flinched, guilt weighing heavy on her shoulders. It wasn't like that. Then tell me what it was like, Alexander shot back, his frustration finally breaking through his usually controlled exterior. Tell me how you justified keeping her from me for 4 years. Clara exhaled slowly, feeling the sting of his words. I was scared, she admitted. I was scared that you would see her as a mistake, that you would feel trapped, that you would resent both of us. Alexander's expression flickered for a second, but then his jaw tightened again. You don't know that. You're right, Clara whispered. I don't, because I never gave you the chance. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with emotions neither of them knew how to process. Finally, Alexander took a slow breath, his gaze shifting back to Daisy. The little girl was still nestled in her mother's arms, playing with the hem of her sleeve, completely unaware of the turmoil surrounding her. Alexander crouched down, leveling himself with her. "Hello, Daisy," he said, his voice softer now. Daisy blinked at him with wide blue eyes. "Hello?" Alexander hesitated for only a second before asking, "Do you know who I am?" Daisy tilted her head slightly, as if studying him. Then she glanced at Clara, as if searching for confirmation before looking back at him. "You're the kind man who helped me," she said matter-of-factly. Alexander let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Yeah," he said. "I'm the kind man who helped you." He hesitated, his voice quieter now. "But I'm also something else." Daisy's brow furrowed slightly, curiosity shining in her bright blue eyes. "What?" Alexander swallowed hard. His throat felt tight, like the words were caught somewhere deep inside him. He had spent years closing himself off, keeping emotions buried beneath layers of business and control. But looking into his daughter's eyes, the eyes that were just like his own, there was no room for anything but the truth. "I'm your dad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Daisy blinked at him, as if trying to process his words. She glanced at Clara again, then back at Alexander. "Really?" Alexander forced a small smile, even though his chest felt like it was about to collapse under the weight of everything. "Yeah," he said. "Really?" Daisy stared at him for another long second, before a small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "Oh!" Alexander let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Then, to his complete surprise, Daisy reached out and took his hand. Alexander felt his entire body go still. Her fingers were small, delicate, warm. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Thorne, the man who had built an empire from nothing, the man who had never let anyone in, felt like he had just found something more important than anything he had ever built. Alexander stared down at the small hand wrapped around his own, feeling something shift deep inside him. Daisy's fingers were so tiny, yet they gripped his hand with the kind of quiet confidence that made his chest tighten. He had spent years negotiating multi-million-pound deals, standing in boardrooms with some of the most powerful people in the world, and yet he had never felt as unprepared as he did at this moment. Daisy's blue eyes, his eyes, blinked up at him with innocent curiosity, as if waiting to see what he would do next. She wasn't scared. She wasn't pulling away. She was just there, holding his hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. Alexander swallowed hard, his mind racing. He should have been furious. He should have been demanding answers, demanding to know why Clara had kept this from him for so long. But standing there, looking at Daisy, the only thing he could think about was how much time he had already lost. 4 years. 4 years of first words, first steps, bedtime stories, scraped knees and laughter, memories he would never get back. Clara's voice broke the silence. "Daisy, sweetheart, why don't you go sit at the counter for a minute? Mummy needs to talk to—" She hesitated, glancing at Alexander before finishing. "Mummy needs to talk to Mr. Thorne." Daisy looked between them, sensing the tension in her mother's voice, but she didn't argue. She simply gave Alexander's hand one last squeeze before letting go and skipping over to the counter, climbing onto a stool with ease. The second she was out of earshot, Alexander turned to Clara, his jaw tight. "We need to talk. Now." Clara exhaled, nodding. "I know." Alexander clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. "Why?" The word came out rough, edged with too many emotions he hadn't had time to process. "Why didn't you tell me?" Clara looked away for a second, her arms crossing over her chest as if bracing herself. "Because I was scared," she admitted. "Because I thought if I told you, you'd feel trapped, that you'd feel like you had to choose between your life and a child you never planned for." Alexander let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. That wasn't your choice to make, Clara. You don't get to decide how I would have felt. You don't get to erase me from my own daughter's life because you assumed I wouldn't want her. Her jaw tightened. You weren't ready, Alexander. I knew it. You knew it. You were working 18-hour days, traveling across the world, building your company. You didn't even have time for yourself, let alone for a baby. Alexander took a step closer, his blue eyes burning into hers. That doesn't mean I wouldn't have tried. Clara flinched slightly at his words, but she didn't look away. I thought I was doing the right thing, she whispered. Alexander exhaled, running a hand through his dark hair. Well, you weren't, he said, his voice lower now. You robbed me of 4 years. You took away my right to know her, to be there for her. And now I'm just supposed to accept that? Clara's throat tightened. I didn't do this to hurt you, Alexander. But you did, he said, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. You hurt both of us. Silence stretched between them, heavy with everything left unsaid. Alexander took another breath, forcing himself to think past the anger, past the resentment. He couldn't change the past, no matter how much he wanted to, no matter how much it ate at him. Those 4 years were gone. But Daisy wasn't. His voice was steadier when he spoke again. I'm not walking away from her, Clara. Clara swallowed hard, nodding. I didn't expect you to. Alexander studied her, searching for any sign that she was still going to fight him on this. But all he saw was exhaustion, guilt, and maybe something else, something like relief. He glanced over at the counter, where Daisy was happily swinging her legs, playing with a small napkin like it was the most fascinating thing in the world. His daughter. He turned back to Clara. We need to figure this out. For her. Clara nodded again, her voice softer this time. Yeah, we do. For the first time that night, Alexander felt like he was finally taking control of something again. But this time, it wasn't about business or power. It was about being a father. Alexander had spent his entire life solving problems, negotiating impossible deals, and turning obstacles into opportunities. But as he sat across from Clara in the small booth of the Daily Grind Cafe, he realized this was the one situation he couldn't approach like a business transaction. There was no strategy, no quick fix, no contract that could rewrite the last 4 years and erase the time he had lost with his daughter. Clara sat across from him, her posture tense, her fingers gripping the edge of the table as if bracing herself for a conversation she had spent years avoiding. Daisy was still perched at the counter, happily sipping on a glass of juice, her small legs swinging beneath the stool. She was blissfully unaware of the emotional battlefield playing out just a few feet away. Alexander leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. His voice was steady, but there was no missing the edge of frustration still lingering beneath it. I need to be in her life, Clara. I don't care how we figure it out, but I'm not walking away from her. Clara exhaled slowly, looking down at the table before meeting his gaze again. I know, she admitted, and I'm not going to stop you. Alexander studied her carefully. He had expected more resistance, more hesitation, but the way she said it, so certain, so resigned, told him she had already made peace with the fact that keeping him away wasn't an option anymore. He nodded, running a hand through his hair. Good, because I'm not asking for permission. Clara's lips pressed into a tight line. I didn't think you were. A moment of silence passed between them, thick with everything they hadn't said. Alexander didn't just want to be a part of Daisy's life. He needed to be. But he also knew this wasn't something that could happen overnight. She didn't know him, and no matter how much he wanted to make up for lost time, he had to accept that it would take time for her to trust him. Clara must have read the thoughts on his face because she sighed, her hands loosening their grip on the table. "She doesn't know anything about you," she admitted. I never told her about you." Alexander clenched his jaw, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Not even my name?" Clara shook her head. She asked once, a long time ago, why she didn't have a dad like some of the other kids at nursery. I told her that families come in all different forms, and that ours was just the two of us. After that, she stopped asking. Alexander's chest tightened. She deserves to know the truth. "I know," Clara said, and for the first time that night, her voice cracked slightly. "But you have to understand, Alexander, she's never had a father figure in her life. She doesn't know what that means. She's used to it just being the two of us." Alexander exhaled, forcing himself to push down the emotions threatening to rise. "Then we take it slow," he said. "I don't want to overwhelm her." Clara hesitated before nodding. "Okay." Alexander leaned back in the booth, trying to process how quickly everything had changed. Hours ago, he had walked into this cafe expecting nothing more than a quiet meal, and now he was sitting across from the mother of his child, trying to figure out how to be a father to a daughter he had never known existed. Clara's voice softened slightly. "She likes you, you know." Alexander's eyes flicked up to meet hers. "She does?" Clara nodded, glancing toward the counter where Daisy was now drawing on a napkin with a red crayon the barista had given her. "She's not usually that comfortable with strangers, but she let you hold her hand. That's not something she does often." Alexander felt a lump form in his throat. He looked at Daisy again, watching the way she scrunched up her face in concentration as she carefully traced a shape on the napkin. He didn't deserve this instant acceptance from her, but he wasn't going to waste it either. "I want to take her out sometime," he said finally. "Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. Just me and her." Clara hesitated, but then nodded. "We can try that." Alexander exhaled slowly, some of the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time since this conversation started. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't enough. But it was a start. And for now, that was all he could ask for. Alexander arrived at the park earlier than planned, pacing near the playground as he tried to settle the unease in his chest. It had been 2 days since his conversation with Clara, 2 days since he had learned he had a daughter, and yet everything still felt surreal. He had spent those nights lying awake, replaying the moment over and over in his head, trying to come to terms with how drastically his life had changed in the span of a single evening. He wasn't afraid of responsibility. He had built an empire from the ground up, made decisions that affected thousands of lives, navigated pressure that would have broken most men. But this was different. This wasn't business. This was personal. A gust of wind rustled the autumn leaves, and Alexander glanced toward the entrance of the park just as Clara appeared, walking hand in hand with Daisy. His breath caught slightly as he took them in, the way Daisy bounced slightly with each step, chattering excitedly to her mother about something, her tiny hands waving animatedly in the air. Clara, on the other hand, looked more reserved, her shoulders tense, as if she was still bracing for how this was all going to go. Alexander swallowed hard, forcing himself to push down the nerves creeping up his spine. He wasn't going to let them get the best of him. He had waited too long for this moment, even if he hadn't known it before. Daisy spotted him first. She stopped mid-sentence, blinking up at him, as if assessing whether he was still the same person from the cafe. Then, to his surprise, she grinned. "You're here," she announced, tugging at Clara's hand before breaking into a run. Alexander barely had time to react before she reached him, stopping just inches away as she tilted her head up at him, with a curious expression. "Did you bring me a book?" Alexander let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Of all the things she could have said, he hadn't expected that. But it made him smile. "I did," he said, reaching into his coat pocket and pulling out a small, hardcover storybook. "Your mother told me you like fairy tales," Daisy gasped dramatically, clutching her hands to her chest. "I love fairy tales. Are there dragons?" Alexander crouched down to her level, nodding. "Big ones. And princesses who aren't afraid of them." Daisy grinned. "I like princesses who fight dragons. They're cooler than the ones who just wait for a prince." Alexander chuckled, glancing up at Clara, who was watching them with a guarded expression. He could tell she was still trying to process how easily Daisy had taken to him. He didn't blame her. He was just as surprised. "Do you want me to read it to you?" he asked, shifting his attention back to Daisy. Daisy thought about it for a moment, then nodded enthusiastically. "But only if we sit on the swings. It's the best place for stories." Alexander hesitated, glancing at Clara for approval. She gave a small nod, her lips pressing together as if she was still deciding how she felt about all of this. "Swings it is," Alexander said, straightening up. Daisy grabbed his hand without hesitation, pulling him toward the playground. Alexander let himself be led, still in awe of how naturally she accepted him. He had expected distance, hesitation, maybe even resistance. But instead, she acted as if he had always been there, as if he was already a part of her world. As they reached the swings, Daisy climbed onto one, motioning for him to sit on the one beside her. Alexander obliged, holding the book in his lap as he opened it. Daisy leaned in close, her legs kicking slightly as she waited for him to start. He began reading, his voice steady, but he was only half focused on the words. His mind kept drifting to the little girl beside him, to the way she listened with such rapt attention, to the way she already trusted him without question. It was humbling in a way nothing else had ever been. Halfway through the story, Daisy suddenly reached for his sleeve, tugging it gently. "You have a nice voice," she said matter-of-factly. "Like a prince." Alexander blinked, caught off guard. He wasn't sure why, but her words settled something deep inside him. Clara, who had been standing a few feet away, let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "That's a first," she murmured. Alexander smirked, shaking his head before turning back to Daisy. "You think so?" Daisy nodded solemnly. "Yep, a prince or maybe a knight." Alexander leaned in slightly, lowering his voice to a playful whisper. "Knights fight dragons, you know." Daisy's eyes widened. "That means you could be one." Alexander chuckled, flipping the page. "Guess we'll have to find out." Clara was still watching them, her arms crossed, but there was something softer in her expression now, something that told Alexander she was seeing something she hadn't expected to see. They stayed at the park for hours, playing, talking, reading more stories. When it was finally time to leave, Daisy hugged Alexander without hesitation, wrapping her small arms around his waist. He froze for half a second before gently returning the hug, something in his chest tightening at the unexpected gesture. As Clara led her toward the car, Daisy looked over her shoulder, waving. "Bye, Knight Alexander." Alexander huffed out a laugh, shaking his head as he waved back. Clara lingered for a moment before finally meeting his gaze. "That went better than I expected." Alexander nodded. "Yeah, it did." There was still so much to figure out, so many conversations left to have. But for the first time since all of this had started, Alexander felt something close to peace. And for now, that was enough. Alexander couldn't stop thinking about the way Daisy had hugged him before leaving the park. It was such a small gesture, something most parents probably took for granted, but to him, it had meant everything. He hadn't expected it. He had barely known what to do when her little arms wrapped around him, trusting and warm. And yet, in that moment, something inside him had settled. Something that had been restless since the night he learned the truth. Now, 2 days later, he stood outside Clara's apartment, shifting his weight as he waited for her to open the door. He had been invited this time, but that didn't make it any easier. He was still an outsider in their world, trying to figure out where he fit in. The door opened, and Clara stood there, her dark eyes scanning his face with the same guarded expression she always wore around him. But there was something different now, something less defensive. She stepped aside without a word, letting him in. The apartment was small, but cozy. The living room was filled with bookshelves, a few framed pictures on the walls, and a couch that had clearly been through years of use. It wasn't grand or extravagant, but it felt like home. And for the first time, Alexander realized just how little he actually knew about the life Clara had built for herself and their daughter. "Daisy's in her room," Clara said, closing the door behind him. "She's been talking about you non-stop since the park." Alexander felt something warm spread through his chest at that. He turned to face Clara fully. "That's a good sign, right?" She nodded slowly, crossing her arms. "Yeah, it is." Before he could say anything else, small, hurried footsteps echoed down the hallway. A second later, Daisy appeared, wearing a bright yellow princess dress, a plastic tiara slightly crooked on her head. She stopped when she saw him, her eyes lighting up. "You came!" Alexander smiled, crouching slightly. "I told you I would." Daisy beamed, then lifted the fabric of her dress as she twirled. "I'm a princess today," she announced, "but not the kind that waits for a prince, the kind that fights dragons." Alexander let out a quiet chuckle. "That's the best kind of princess." Daisy nodded seriously. "Mommy says you're staying for dinner." Alexander glanced at Clara, who was now leaning against the kitchen counter, watching their interaction with a quiet expression. "If that's okay with you," Clara shrugged. She insisted. Daisy grabbed his hand, pulling him toward the couch. "Do you like shepherd's pie? Mommy makes the best shepherd's pie." Alexander let himself be led, sitting down as she climbed onto the couch beside him, her dress puffing up around her. "I love shepherd's pie," he said. "Do I get to help?" Daisy gasped. "You want to help?" He smirked, glancing at Clara. "I think I can manage stirring a pot." Daisy giggled, then leaned in as if she were about to tell him a very important secret. "Mommy doesn't like when people mess up her kitchen." Clara rolled her eyes from across the room. "Daisy, don't scare him off before he even tries." Alexander laughed, feeling something unfamiliar settle in his chest. This moment, sitting in their home, listening to Daisy talk, watching Clara pretend she wasn't amused, felt real. It felt like something he had never allowed himself to want, something he had convinced himself he didn't need. But now that he was here, he realized just how wrong he had been. Dinner was easy, surprisingly so. Daisy talked the entire time, filling every silence with stories about school, her favorite books, and the way her stuffed animals had different voices when she played with them. Alexander listened, genuinely fascinated by the way her mind worked. Every now and then, Clara would interject, rolling her eyes at Daisy's dramatics or reminding her to actually eat her food instead of just talking about it. And then there was the moment he hadn't expected. After dinner, Daisy pulled out a stack of crayons and a few sheets of paper, setting up on the coffee table. She was drawing something with intense concentration, her tongue poking out slightly as she worked. Alexander leaned over, watching her. "What are you making?" Daisy looked up at him, then down at the paper before holding it up for him to see. It was a picture. 3 stick figures, one clearly smaller than the others, all holding hands. There was a house in the background, a sun in the corner, and a big blue scribble above them that he assumed was the sky. She pointed at each figure as she spoke. "This is me. This is Mommy. And this," she tapped the tallest figure, "this is you." Alexander stared at the drawing, something tight forming in his throat. He wasn't sure what to say, wasn't sure how to process the fact that, in her mind, he was already part of her life. Clara, who had been clearing the table, glanced over. Her eyes softened when she saw the drawing, but she didn't say anything. She just let the moment sit between them, giving him space to take it in. Alexander cleared his throat, forcing himself to speak past the lump there. "That's a pretty amazing drawing." Daisy beamed. "Do you like it?" Alexander nodded. "I love it." Daisy seemed satisfied with that answer, immediately going back to coloring in the sky. Alexander sat back, exhaling slowly as he ran a hand through his hair. He had spent his entire life chasing success, thinking that was the only thing that mattered. But sitting here, watching his daughter draw their family on a piece of paper, he realized he had been wrong. He didn't just want to be a part of her life. He needed to be. Alexander wasn't sure how long he sat there, staring at the drawing Daisy had made. It was just a simple picture, scribbled with bright colors and uneven lines. But to him, it meant more than anything else he had achieved in his life. His name had been on Forbes covers, on corporate buildings, on contracts worth millions. Yet here it was, drawn in crayon beside 2 stick figures labeled Mommy and Daisy, as if he had always belonged there. Daisy, oblivious to the weight of what she had done, continued coloring, humming softly to herself. Clara moved around the apartment, gathering plates and wiping down the counters, but every now and then he caught her watching him. She wasn't looking at him with anger anymore, or even with hesitation. It was something softer, something that almost made him wonder if she had been waiting for this moment just as much as he had. "Daisy," Clara finally said, breaking the silence. "It's almost bedtime." Daisy let out a dramatic sigh, setting down her crayon, as if the weight of responsibility was too much for her to bear. "Do I have to?" Clara arched a brow. "Do you want to be a grumpy dragon tomorrow?" Daisy considered this for a moment before sighing again, clearly defeated. "Fine." Alexander watched as she stood up, stretching her arms before turning to him with wide, expectant eyes. "Are you going to be here tomorrow?" Alexander hesitated, glancing at Clara. He wasn't sure what the right answer was, wasn't sure if he was overstepping. But before he could even speak, Clara gave a small nod, barely noticeable, but enough to tell him she wasn't going to push him away. He looked back at Daisy and smiled. "Yeah, I'll be here." Daisy grinned, satisfied with his answer. She walked over, hesitated for just a second, then wrapped her small arms around his middle, hugging him tight. Alexander barely had time to react before she pulled away, running off down the hall to her room. He sat there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. It had only been days since he found out about her, and yet somehow, she had already decided he belonged. Clara leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching him carefully. "She's already attached to you," she said quietly. "You can't disappear." Alexander met her gaze, something solid and unwavering in his own. "I'm not going anywhere." Clara studied him for a long moment before nodding. She pushed off the counter, heading toward the hallway, but before she disappeared, she paused. "Good night, Alexander." It was the first time she had said his name without tension, without hesitation, without a wall between them. He exhaled, leaning back against the couch. "Good night, Clara." As he sat there, listening to the faint sound of Daisy giggling from her room as Clara read her a bedtime story, Alexander realized that for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was running after something he could never catch. He wasn't chasing another deal, another success, another number on a balance sheet. For the first time, he was exactly where he needed to be, and he wasn't going to let it go. A meaningful ending. The unplanned fortune. Alexander Blackwood's journey isn't just about discovering a hidden daughter. It's a profound exploration of what it means to truly live versus simply control. He built an empire on logic, but Daisy, with her innocent questions and spontaneous affection, teaches him that the most valuable things in life often defy all plans. His initial shock and anger at Clara's secret slowly give way to a fierce, protective love for his daughter, forcing him to confront the emotional void he had unknowingly carried. Clara's decision to keep Daisy a secret, born from fear and a misunderstanding of Alexander's priorities, highlights the complex choices parents sometimes make under duress. Her eventual trust in Alexander, symbolized by her quiet nod and the softening of her guarded demeanor, marks a crucial step towards healing. The beauty of their unfolding story lies in the small, authentic moments. Alexander reading bedtime stories, learning to make shepherd's pie, and seeing his own reflection in Daisy's trusting sapphire eyes. These aren't grand gestures of wealth, but simple acts of presence and connection that redefine his idea of success. The crayon drawing, a child's innocent representation of their family, becomes more precious than any corporate accolade. Ultimately, this is a story about the richness found not in bank accounts, but in unexpected connections. It's about how the greatest treasures are often hidden in plain sight, waiting for us to be truly present to find them. Alexander Blackwood, the man of control, finally understands that true abundance is found in the unpredictable, messy, and infinitely rewarding landscape of family. Thank you all for watching this incredible story. Don't forget to like, comment with your thoughts on Alexander and Daisy's journey, and share this video with someone who needs to hear its message. Remember, the most profound changes often begin with the most unexpected encounters. See you in the next video.